The sound of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping me company that night. Each beep echoed in the small, dimly lit ER room, counting every second of pain, loneliness, and disbelief. My phone lay beside me on the white sheets, its cracked screen glowing faintly with the last message I'd sent just minutes ago. "I'm in the emergency room. Please come." For a few moments I stared at it, expecting the 3 dots to appear, a reply, a sign, anything. But instead I got nothing, until it buzzed again. I remember the feeling in my chest when I opened it. Not relief, not comfort. Just a sentence so cold it almost stopped my heart. "Don't bother us." Those 3 words. They burned into me more painfully than the IV in my arm. I stared at them until my vision blurred. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, care for me, love me, told me I was a burden. And that moment changed everything inside me. You grow up believing love is unconditional, that no matter how bad things get, your family is your safe place. But that night, under the harsh fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of machines, I realized how wrong I'd been. The doctor had said it was exhaustion, dehydration, low blood sugar, maybe stress. But what he didn't know was that it wasn't my body that broke that night. It was my faith in the people who raised me. I remember scrolling through our old family photos as I waited for the nurse. My mother's arm around me on my graduation day. My father's smile when he handed me the car keys for the first time. Those memories didn't feel like mine anymore. They felt like scenes from someone else's life. A movie where I'd been an extra pretending to belong. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling the weight of everything they'd ever said to make me small. The constant comparisons to my brother, the way they dismissed my pain as drama, the way they only called when they needed something. It all came flooding back, each memory hitting harder than the last. When the nurse came in to check on me, she asked if anyone was coming to pick me up. I just smiled weakly and said, "No, they're busy." I don't know why I covered for them. Maybe habit, maybe denial, or maybe I didn't want to admit to a stranger that I was completely alone in the world. But in that stillness, in that cold white room where no one came, something inside me shifted. I stopped waiting for their love, stopped hoping they'd change. Instead, a calm kind of clarity began to form. It wasn't anger, not yet, just realization. I knew one thing for sure. They would remember this night. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day they'd feel what I felt. Not through shouting, not through vengeance, but through silence, the same silence they gave me. As I signed the discharge papers the next morning and stepped out into the pale sunlight, I promised myself that I wouldn't chase them anymore. I'd build my own life, my own peace, but I'd do it in a way they'd never be able to ignore. They left me alone in the ER, but they had no idea. I was about to show them what it truly meant to be forgotten. Before that night in the ER, my life had always revolved around trying to earn what should have come naturally: love. I was the middle child in a house where affection was conditional, and approval was currency. My parents never raised their voices, but their silence carried more weight than any insult could. My father was a man who measured worth by achievement. He believed emotion was weakness, and empathy was a distraction. My mother followed his lead, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. In our house, feelings were managed like schedules. You could express them, but only at convenient times. I used to think if I worked hard enough, I'd change that. I threw myself into everything: grades, scholarships, competitions. I was the kid who came home with awards and certificates that ended up in a drawer no one opened. My brother Daniel was the golden one, the one who didn't have to try. He had that easy charm people loved. He could forget my birthday and still be their pride. I could win academic awards, get into a top program, and all I'd get was a distracted, "That's good, honey." But it wasn't just favoritism, it was a pattern. Every time I needed them, they disappeared behind excuses. When I had pneumonia at 16, they were at Daniel's soccer game. When I graduated with honors, they said the ceremony was too far. I told myself it didn't matter. That being independent was strength, but deep down, I was just a daughter still waiting for someone to notice she was tired. The weeks leading up to the ER night were a blur. I'd been working 2 part-time jobs while finishing my degree. barely sleeping, barely eating. My mother called once during that time to ask if I could send money for Daniel's car insurance. I said yes, even though I was behind on rent. That's the kind of love I was trained to give. Selfless, invisible, one-sided. I'd begun to notice how empty our calls had become. They didn't ask how I was, just if I could do something. Book flights, transfer money, fix something online. I could feel the emotional distance growing, but I didn't know how to close it. So, when I felt dizzy and collapsed at work, the first person I thought to text was my mom. Some part of me still believed she'd come running. That's what made her reply sting so deeply. Don't bother us. It wasn't just words. It was confirmation. A lifetime of being an afterthought distilled into 3 cold syllables. After that night, I went back to my small apartment. But it didn't feel like home. Everything looked the same. The beige walls, the stack of unopened mail. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside me. I stopped reaching out. I didn't send good morning texts or answer their calls. Weeks passed before they noticed. Then one afternoon, my mother called out of the blue. Her voice was casual, cheerful even, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, sweetheart. Could you help me with Daniel's resume? He's applying for a new job." I remember staring at my phone in disbelief. She hadn't asked if I was okay, not once. I could still hear the monitor beeping in my head from that hospital room, and now she wanted help for him. Something inside me hardened. I said yes, not because I wanted to, but because I realized something. They only saw value in me when I was useful, and I could use that. I started noticing their patterns, how they reached out only when they needed something, how they depended on me in quiet, invisible ways. My father couldn't manage online banking without me. My mother didn't know how to pay bills electronically. Even Daniel, the golden child, relied on me for job applications and interviews. That's when the idea began forming. Not revenge exactly, but balance. A way to show them the cost of their indifference. I didn't need to yell or confront them. I'd let silence do the talking this time. The same silence they once gave me. It started quietly, just like they had taught me. I stopped calling first. I stopped fixing things. When my father's emails bounced back, I didn't reply with instructions. When my mother forgot her online passwords again, I didn't reset them. I let the silence stretch, just to see if they'd notice. At first, they didn't. Days passed, then weeks. My absence didn't make noise. It just echoed. I could tell they assumed I was busy, the way they always did when I was hurting. But then, small cracks began to appear. Daniel called one evening, sounding annoyed. "Mom's been asking about you," he said. "She says she can't reach you." I paused before answering. "She can," I said softly. "She just hasn't tried hard enough." The line went quiet. He didn't know what to say. None of them ever did when the mask slipped. A few days later, I got a text from my mom. "Can you come by this weekend? Dad needs help with the taxes. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just expectation." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I'm not feeling well. Maybe another time." A lie, yes, but one that carried truth. I wasn't sick anymore, not physically, but there was a new kind of ache inside me. One that came from finally seeing how disposable I'd been all along. Weeks turned into months. I learned to live without their constant shadow. I spent weekends walking through quiet streets, reading in cafes, rediscovering what it meant to exist for myself. The silence that once suffocated me began to feel like peace, but peace never lasts in families built on control. The calls turned into guilt trips. My mother left voicemails in a soft, trembling voice, reminding me how family should stay close. My father sent curt messages asking if I'd forgotten my duties. No, I hadn't forgotten. I just stopped volunteering to be the forgotten one. And though they didn't know it yet, the imbalance they created, the neglect, the dismissal, was slowly returning to them. For the first time in my life, they were the ones waiting for my reply. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day that almost tricks you into believing nothing can go wrong. I was sitting by the window, sunlight spilling across the pages of a book I wasn't really reading, when my phone buzzed. It was my mother, again. This time, though, her voice was softer than usual. "Honey," she began, "your father hasn't been feeling well. He's been so stressed lately. Maybe you could come by." I froze. There it was. Not love, but obligation disguised as care. They knew I wouldn't ignore something like that. Even after everything, the thought of him being unwell tugged at the old reflex inside me. So I went. When I walked through the front door, the smell of coffee and disinfectant hit me. The same smell that used to mean comfort. My father was sitting in the living room, perfectly fine, flipping through the newspaper. My mother looked relieved, almost too relieved. That's when I realized it wasn't concern that brought me there. It was manipulation. "You're here," my father said without looking up. "Finally. The Wi-Fi's been down for 2 days." The words sliced through the fragile thread holding me together. 2 days. That was their emergency. I stood there, silent, watching them pretend like everything was normal. Like they hadn't left me to face the cold beeps of an ER machine alone. I wanted to walk out right then, but instead I sat down. Maybe part of me needed to see it, to confirm that the people I'd been trying to forgive hadn't changed at all. My mother started talking about Daniel's new job, how proud they were, how he might buy a house soon. Every word felt like salt on a wound I thought had begun to heal. She looked at me and smiled. "You should come by more often. Family's important, you know." That sentence broke something. Family's important to people who know how to be one. When I didn't respond, her smile faltered. "You're awfully quiet lately," she said. "You've been distant. It's starting to worry us." Worry them? After months of silence from me. After that night in the ER. Now they were worried? I laughed quietly, bitterly. "I texted you from a hospital bed," I said. "You told me not to bother you." The room went still. My mother blinked, taken aback. My father's eyes lifted from the paper for the first time. "You're exaggerating," he said, voice calm but dismissive. "You've always been too sensitive." That line, "too sensitive," was their weapon of choice. It erased everything. Every pain, every truth, every cry for attention reduced to emotional noise. I stood up slowly. "You're right," I said softly. "I am sensitive. Sensitive enough to finally see you for who you are." Their faces changed. Confusion, then discomfort. But not guilt. Never guilt. I walked to the door, my heart pounding. My mother called after me, "We're your parents. Don't forget that." I didn't look back. "I could never forget," I said. "You made sure of that." That night I blocked their numbers. No message, no explanation. Just silence, the kind they had always given me. But silence, I soon learned, has a way of echoing back louder than any scream. Over the next few weeks, the calls started coming from Daniel. At first casual, then desperate. My parents were apparently confused, hurt, saying they didn't deserve this treatment. For the first time, they were feeling what I had felt for years, invisible, ignored, unimportant. And maybe that should have been enough for me. But the truth is, their betrayal ran too deep for silence alone to heal it. Because what they did next, the way they twisted my absence into blame, would turn my quiet, withdrawal into something else entirely. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was coming. Revenge wasn't a dramatic script in my head. It didn't look like a cliffside confrontation or a viral video reveal. It looked like a life rebuilt quietly, piece by piece, in a way that would make them notice the hole they'd left, and feel it. I wanted them to understand what being needed and then discarded actually tasted like. Not with shouting, but with absence that mattered. First, I erased my old reflexes. I stopped answering the little emergencies that used to pull me home. The tech problems, the paperwork, the last-minute favors. I let their world become a little messier, but mess alone wouldn't teach them anything. They'd adapt. So I did something they'd never expect. I became reliably unavailable, not out of spite, but out of boundaries. I made a list. It was clinical, almost absurdly calm. The list had dates they had failed me. The nights they'd prioritized Daniel, the birthdays they'd skipped, the times they'd dismissed my pain as drama. I wrote the facts without flourish. Facts don't beg for forgiveness. They demand recognition. Then I built scaffolding for my life that didn't need them. I found a job that paid what my parents said I'd never earn. I took a class that made me laugh again. I learned to change my own passwords and fix my own accounts. I moved into an apartment with sunlight that didn't make me think of hospital fluorescence. Every small victory was a brick in the wall I was building between their expectations and my future. But the real shift was subtle and intentional. I stopped being their invisible help desk and started being a person with a calendar. When my mother texted about help with the taxes, I replied that I was booked, and I meant it. When my father asked for my advice on a bank form, I sent them a link to a freelancer who did accounting. It cost them a small fee. That fee felt like a currency I'd never been allowed to spend on myself. I also began to plant seeds in places they frequented. Not lies, only truths told gently. At a neighbor's gathering, I mentioned in passing that I'd started a consulting project. At a school reunion, I let a former teacher know I'd been promoted. These were not boasts. They were signals. I wanted them to see me moving on without theatrics. I wanted other people to see me as someone they had taken for granted. There was one move I saved for last, the quietest, and to me, the most satisfying. My parents had always relied on me for the little things that kept their dignity intact. I was their proof that they could manage, so I stopped being their proof. I redirected the small automatic transfers I had been sending to Daniel's car fund into an account I used to save for my own future. When they asked where the money had gone, I told them the truth. I kept it. I had working savings now. I was tired of paying for a role I'd never been asked to accept. It wasn't cruel. It was a boundary given form. The first time my mother called and asked why she hadn't received money, her voice cracked. "We thought you would always be there," she said. Hearing that, the regret mixed with entitlement, was all the confirmation I needed. They felt the absence where they had created it. I also began to refuse the scripted apologies they expected. When my father sent the perfunctory "we love you" text after weeks of silence, I didn't reply. Their guilt lottery had always been paid for by my forgiveness. I stopped cashing in those tickets. If they wanted my time, they would have to ask and actually offer something that looked like care. Still, this plan wasn't built on cruelty. I continued to show up for myself. I found friends who called because they wanted to, not because they needed a fix. I volunteered at a community center where my presence was welcomed, not weighed. I learned to cook, to sleep more soundly, to laugh without checking my phone for their approval. The real revenge, if you could call it that, was becoming someone who no longer needed their approval to exist. When my parents realized they couldn't pull me back into their orbit with a text or a crisis, the fabric of their certainty frayed. They started to notice the small things: an empty chair at Sunday dinner, a voice missing from family group chats, the sudden inconvenience of doing things themselves. They began to show up more, not to see me exactly, but to fill the gaps I'd left. Daniel thanked me for a trick I hadn't done. My mother commented on a post I'd never told her about. Those were the first small tremors of recognition. They reached for me reflexively and found that I had already woven a new life where I wasn't waiting at their door. Part of me wondered if that was enough. Would their discomfort ever become true remorse? Would they remember the ER beep as something more than an inconvenient story? I didn't know. But what I did know was this: I had stopped letting their indifference define me. I had turned their neglect into my fuel, so I kept going, quietly, methodically. Every time they asked for help and I chose myself instead, the plan advanced. Every small refusal was a lesson. Every boundary I set was a sentence in a book they didn't know they were reading, the book of who I would become without them. They had left me in the ER. I had chosen to reply with a life they could not borrow. That, more than any confrontation, was my message. It was almost poetic how the universe chose timing. A full year had passed since the night in the ER. 1 year of silence, boundaries, and quiet self-repair. I didn't plan anniversaries for pain, but life has a cruel way of circling back to the moment you thought you'd escaped. It started with a phone call from Daniel. His voice trembled, something I'd never heard before. "Dad's in the hospital," he said. "Mom's asking for you. She says he needs you." The words landed heavy, echoing the ones I'd once sent to them. "I'm in the emergency room." I felt the air shift around me, that strange symmetry of fate drawing its perfect, painful circle. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the wall, feeling both the old wound reopen and the quiet strength of the scar beneath it. I could have ignored the call. I could have let them feel what abandonment truly tastes like. But part of me wanted to see them, not to forgive, not to comfort, but to witness the consequences of a lifetime of choices. When I arrived at the hospital, the halls smelled the same, antiseptic and sorrow. The beeping machines, the sterile air, the low hum of life holding on, it was all too familiar. But this time, I wasn't the one lying on the bed. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Not weak, but human. My mother sat by his side, her hand on his, her eyes tired and swollen. When she saw me, her breath caught. For a second, she didn't say a word, maybe afraid I wouldn't answer her again. "You came," she whispered. I nodded. "You asked me to." She started to cry then, quietly. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for pity but comes from regret that's finally found its voice. "I'm sorry," she said, the words trembling. "For that night, for everything. We didn't know how much we hurt you. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt heavy, like the end of something that had been dying for years." My father looked at me then, not as the daughter who failed to live up to expectations, but as someone he'd wronged. His voice was frail but clear. "You were always the strong one," he said. "We just didn't see it. I wanted to tell him I didn't need his validation anymore, that I'd already built a life beyond their reach, but instead I simply said, 'I know.'" We sat in silence for a while, the same silence that once felt like punishment now carrying something gentler. My mother kept talking, about how they'd been lonely, how Daniel had tried to fill the space I left but couldn't, how every small inconvenience reminded them of what they'd taken for granted. When she said, "We thought you'd always be there," I met her eyes and said quietly, "That's what I thought too." The words landed between us like truth neither of us could escape. That night, when I left the hospital, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. For the first time, the beeping of the machines didn't haunt me. It soothed me. Because this time, I wasn't the one waiting for someone to show up. A few days later, my father was discharged. My mother called to thank me for coming, her tone fragile, almost reverent. But I didn't go back. Not right away. I kept my distance, still letting silence be my language. Not of punishment now, but of peace. I think they finally understood that love wasn't something owed. It was something nurtured. You can't neglect someone for years and expect devotion on demand. They'd learned that in the hardest way possible, not through revenge, but through reflection. And me? I learned that letting go isn't always a quiet walk away. Sometimes it's standing still while the people who hurt you finally turn and see what they've done. That was the moment I realized my revenge had already worked. Not because they suffered, but because I no longer did. After the hospital, something shifted quietly between us. My parents didn't suddenly become warm, affectionate people. That kind of change takes a lifetime they no longer had. But they became aware. The tone of their voices softened. The small talk stopped sounding like a script. They started reaching out, not to ask for things, but to share things. My mother sent pictures of her garden, the same one I used to help her plant when I was little. My father forwarded an article about emotional boundaries, a small, awkward gesture, but it spoke louder than any apology. And yet, I didn't rush back. I learned that forgiveness isn't a door you walk through for someone else. It's one you build for yourself. I didn't forgive to fix them. I forgave to free myself. I moved apartments again, this time closer to the sea. The air there felt cleaner, like it carried fewer ghosts. Some weekends I'd walk by the shore with my phone buzzing in my pocket. Unread messages waiting, not ignored out of anger anymore, but out of peace. I knew my parents were learning their own lessons in silence. They didn't demand explanations or push for reconciliation. Maybe they finally understood that love isn't a favor, it's a presence. And presence, once lost, is hard to earn back. When I visited months later, the house felt smaller, quieter. My father greeted me with a cautious smile. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't reach for me. She just said, "Thank you for coming." That was enough. No grand speeches, no apologies rehearsed too late. Just a simple, human acknowledgement. As I sat with them that evening, the air heavy but calm, I realized I didn't need them to make things right. I'd already done that by surviving the parts of my life they'd missed. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the one who remembered everything and still chose peace. Sometimes the deepest revenge isn't in shouting or punishment. It's in standing quietly, unshaken, and letting life itself rewrite the balance. I learned that absence can teach more than confrontation, and that boundaries aren't walls to hurt others, but shields to protect yourself. My parents finally understood the weight of neglect, not because I made them suffer, but because I chose to value myself above their expectations. In the end, survival became my victory. Their regret became the echo of lessons they had ignored for years. And I stepped into a life where I was seen, heard, and remembered. Not as a duty, but as a person. This is revenge untold, where justice isn't loud, but it always arrives.